It is my great pleasure to introduce Andy Lipman, who's been a great advocate, friend, someone that the competitive industry across all platforms, all technologies, from the days of long distance and emerging competition to satellite, today to broadband. Every segment of the industry knows Andy Lipman. They know his great work. We've had so many of our member companies with INCOMPAS and CommTel over our 40 years where Andy just did a tremendous job. He and his team, he's been practicing law after graduating Stanford University in 1977 since 1978. INCOMPAS began in 1981. And if we're the founding voice of competition, Andy is one of the founding attorneys and advocates that has represented so well so many of the clients and member companies and issues that have been critical to the competitive industry's success. So we welcome him here today, his rich legacy, as he talks about what is to come, what is the future in broadband and broadband funding, and the emerging legislation and policies that will shape the future for the competitive industry and all the different member companies of INCOMPAS and those that are active in the deployment of the new networks, 5G, wireless and wired for the future. Andy, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Chip. You know, I have a very special place in my heart for INCOMPAS. I've been to every show, and I think INCOMPAS, more than any other entity, is responsible for our world of competitive telecom today. I also want to thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. It reminds me of a comment that Lyndon Johnson once made after he was introduced. He said, "I wish my parents were here to have listened to that." Said, "My father, you know, would have been proud, and my mother would have actually even believed it." So based on that, let's talk about Congress and where the money is for infrastructure.
Well, thank you again, and thank you for being with us, Andy.
This is a really unusual opportunity to talk about an extraordinary amount of money that Congress is considering implicating for telecommunications broadband. And what I'm going to talk about is the bipartisan infrastructure bill in the Senate, which we expect to pass in the House, which I think has extraordinary opportunities for many INCOMPAS members. So why don't we start? Many of you undoubtedly have read about the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's $1 trillion in new spending, of which 550 million is actually new spending. But the more significant point is it's spending over 5 years. The reason I mention that is that most of the other existing FCC spending programs like RDOF and others are over 10 years. So keep that in mind in terms of funding. Of that $1 trillion, 65 billion has been allocated for broadband. At one point, some of the early sponsors were looking at 100 billion. The moderates pushed back, saying there was about 35 billion in existing broadband spending. So the number was reduced down to 65 billion. Interestingly, in the budget reconciliation bill, which will be the companion measure one way or the other to this broadband and infrastructure bill, members in both the House and Senate are looking to raise an additional 10 to 20 to 25 billion dollars more for broadband. We'll see if that actually happens, as that budget reconciliation bill is actually being cut back. But I would look at the 65 billion as a floor, not a ceiling. The bill passed the Senate in mid-August, and it passed by a pretty significant bipartisan vote, 69-30. The House will take the bill up, but they do not intend to make any changes to the Senate draft, either to the infrastructure bill in toto or the broadband section specifically. There's still enormous questions on how the infrastructure bill will be tied timing-wise, sequence-wise to the Budget Reconciliation Act. But when the House does vote on the infrastructure bill, it will be a thumbs up, thumbs down vote on that bill without any changes to the Senate version. And we very much expect the House to pass the bill. That's what we're hearing from our congressional contacts. And indeed, there's so much support for broadband and bipartisan support. Even if for some reason the infrastructure bill fails, I think we'll see the broadband bill passed in a separate form. When? That's the question. Probably October, November. They're actually shooting, ironically, for a October 31 Halloween date. So stay tuned. Next slide. I did mention that there, in addition to the $65 billion that will be enacted in this broadband bill, there's another approximately $35 billion or so in existing funding. And I think it's important to focus on it. Why? Some of you may have heard of the 1960s bank robber Willie Sutton. Somebody asked him, Willie, why do you rob banks? And Willie famously said, because that's where the money is. Well, here's the money now. The money is likely to be significantly increased. We expect when the broadband bill passes, there'll be about 3 times as much money spent over the next 5 years for broadband as has been spent each year for the prior 5 years. So as you can see, the existing programs are really in 4 different buckets: FCC, Rural Utility Service, NTIA, and Treasury. And Congress paid attention to this because they were looking at a model of how to dispense the funds in the broadband bill. And I think the view was they would have preferred it to be dispersed through the executive agency and not the FCC. I think there was some concern about how long the FCC would take, some concern about the RDOF program, which is the successor to CAF and CAF2, where there were a number of ineligible bidders or bidders that weren't sufficiently qualified to do the broadband. Counties and census blocks were sent back. So rather than have a beauty contest, as we saw a decade ago under the Obama BTOP program, what the Congress did was look at all these programs and decide, first off, absolutely none of these programs are going to be cut back or reduced under the infrastructure bill. So the infrastructure bill really stands on the shoulders of all these existing programs. In fact, the infrastructure bill actually stretches out the timeline for some of these programs. The infrastructure bill is basically a hybrid of some of the agencies that we see here. We'll see the money is being spent by the NTIA in block grants to the states, which really follows the Treasury Department, a model in the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund. More about that in a second. That's part of the American Recovery Act. But the FCC plays a role, and we'll see that all these agencies, FCC, RUS, NTIA, all play a complementary role in terms of dispensing the money. But importantly, all these funds are still available now. will continue to be available once the broadband bill is enacted, most likely later this quarter. Next slide. So I want to mention briefly the Treasury Department Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund. Not all of that money is going to go to broadband, but some of it will. In fact, a significant part will. And the Treasury Department released guidelines just last week in terms of how the money will be spent, particularly as to broadband. And I believe it's going to be very illustrative in terms of the relationship between the states and the feds under this Treasury program, which I believe will be largely repeated in terms of how the bulk of the broadband funds are going to be spent. So if you study this slide for a minute or two, I think it will give you a very valuable window or a canary in the coal mine in terms of the dynamics of how the feds and states are going to spend the broadband money. Okay, so under this existing program, Treasury gets to allocate $10 billion, okay? And it's basically block grants to the states and the US territories. States and the US territories have a several month, 3-month period, which opened 2 weeks ago to submit their applications to Treasury and to get their funding request in no later than the 27th of December. Little different schedule for tribal governments. Basically, the Treasury Department is going to leave it to the states, mostly the governors and mostly the economic development offices to make the recommendations. Some states like Pennsylvania, Florida have infrastructure or broadband commissions. Those states, it's going to be the broadband commissions that do the heavy lifting. So if you're going to do your lobbying, don't bother lobbying on the federal level. The lobbying is going to be on the state level to the governors, to the broadband commissions, if the state has one, and the economic development offices, not directly to the legislature, not directly to the PUC. So under this program, keep this in mind because we'll hear about this in a minute under the bill. Each state and territory gets a down payment of $100 million each. Okay, so that's about a little more than the 5.67 billion, given the 50 states and the 7 or 8 territories. And the remainder of the money will be allocated state by state based on this algorithm of the size of the state, the population, the number of low-income residents, and the rural nature of the state. The standard here for broadband is higher than it's in the act. It's a symmetrical 100 megabits up and down standard, which is a little higher in the act. There's a stronger preference here for fiber than there is in the act, but there are very few strings attached other than service providers have to offer a low-cost option, which many of you INCOMPAS members are doing anyways. Okay, so keep this in mind. Next slide. And again, I think this is Capital Projects Fund is important because what we're hearing from the states, and we've talked to 3 dozen states, the states say, look, we're going to go through this drill the end of 2021. We're not going to reinvent the wheel for applying for broadband funding in 2022. This is pretty much what we're going to do. So again, under both programs, this program and the infrastructure bill, it's the states that apply generally for funding from the federal agencies. It's not like BTOP. There's no beauty contest at the NTIA. The decision is made, in the state capitals, the Hartfords, the Jefferson cities, the Tallahassees of the country, in terms of how the funds are dispersed And those are the inflection points. Those are the geographies where you want to focus on positioning yourself to get the money, both these existing funds and more significantly, the money under the broadband infrastructure bill. Next slide. So let's talk about the evolution briefly of the broadband infrastructure bill. As I mentioned, it started out 100 billion. Most of the pushback came from moderates, including particularly on this section, Senator Susan Collins from Maine, that brought the number down to 65 billion. The initial bill was heavily tilted toward overbuilding. The actual bill actually discourages money for overbuilding and strongly prioritizes funds for unserved and underserved areas. What do I mean by that? Well, unserved is an area where 80% of the population has less than 20 megabits down, 3 up, and underserved are areas where 80% of the population have areas with not 100 down and 20 up. So those are the sweet spots that are going to get money. Some of the earlier versions of the bill, the Democratic versions, heavily favored giving money to municipalities and local governments, which is what we saw under the Obama BTOP program a decade ago. The actual bill is provider neutral. There's no preference or incentive, disincentive, whether you're a local government or a private entity. Of our discussions with about 36 states, we're hearing virtually all of them are looking to give most of the money, if not all the money, to private entities as the subrecipients to get the network out there. There was some discussion of having network neutrality or some version of that in the initial bill that was taken out of the ultimate bill. Same thing with rate regulation. So as we can see, a fairly significant evolution from the initial proposal to the actual proposal that was passed by the Senate on August 10th. Next slide. So this slide, which tests my ability of, preparing PowerPoints, shows how the $65 billion will be spent under the bill. And as you can see, again, thinking of our bank robber friend, Willie Sutton, where's the money? You can see that about 2/3 or 3/4 of the money, $42.5 billion, will be spent by the NTIA on the broadband equity deployment program. That was increased from what was originally in the bill. The next biggest block, the $14.25 billion, mostly for affordability and accessibility, and that was decreased. The remaining, $9-10 billion up on the top of the bar, as we'll see, are mostly deployment programs. So probably 3/4 of the bill deployment, the remainder affordability and accessibility. So let's go to the next slide, which I submit is actually the most important slide here. So if you're only going to focus on one slide, this is the slide to focus on, because this is actually where the bulk of the money is. So who's administering this $42.5 billion? It's the NTIA. How are they administering it? It's going to be block grants to the states and to the US territories. Are there preferable entities? No. Okay, there's no restrictions on eligibility. There's no preference for municipalities. There's no thumb on the scale for governments as opposed to the private sector. How's the money going to be spent? Mostly end mile infrastructure. but also mid-mile and also end-mile/mid-mile. Okay. How is the money going to be prioritized? As I said, not for overbuilding existing networks like yours. It's going to be primarily for unserved and underserved areas, high poverty areas. You know, what are the speeds? Basically 120, which would be the minimum speed. I would look at that as table stakes with the ability to scale that up. I think that does give a preference for the most part to fiber, also some high-speed wireless point to point. One other key point here is that the sub-grantees, namely yourself, have to offer both a low-cost service option, which I presume many of you are doing already, and contribute at least 25% of the costs. I think this is helpful in terms of eliminating a lot of free money types who really don't have the ways and means or wherewithal to build. The other thing we saw under BTOP a decade ago, some of this matching share can be in soft dollars or in-kind contributions, like service to the state, by capacity to the state, by serving state or local institutions. So it does, depending on the state, it doesn't necessarily have to be a dollar for dollar share. What's the NOFO? Actually, what is NOFO? NOFO is a notice of funding opportunity, okay? 180 days after enactment, the way it will work, and remember, this is what we talked about a minute ago under the Treasury program. Each state, each territory gets a immediate down payment of $100 million. The remaining money, let's say 37 billion, will be allocated out after the FCC completes its mapping efforts, which is headed up by Gene Cadu at the FCC. We expect that to be probably late 2022. So expect 5.5 or 6 billion under this 42 billion to be allocated almost immediately after the NOFO, and then the rest in late 2022, 2023. Are there strings attached? Actually, very little. First of all, you can't use Chinese equipment. Secondly, you have to, if you are laying fiber optic, you have to include interspersed conduit access points. So though, as we saw in the BTOP, that was rarely used. And you have to offer a low-cost broadband option. So you may ask yourself, well, what's a low-cost broadband option? That's really up to the states to decide, but I think it's probably similar, more or less, to the EBB program, where you can also use the EBB dollars. So relatively few strings attached. There is a requirement that the money be available and the service commence 48 months or 4 years from the time of the award. Okay, I mean, again, that is the bulk of the money. And if you're in network deployment, this is the program you want to focus on. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's the second biggest bucket. It's the Affordable Connectivity Program. Yes, does this sound familiar? It's formerly the EBB, Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which is very successful. I think as of this week, there are 6.2, 6.3 million subscribers, and that's rising. The subsidy amount is going to be reduced from $50 to $30, but a number of members of Congress under the Budget Reconciliation Act, remember the companion bill, want to bridge this gulf and try to increase the subsidy back to something approaching $50. We'll see if they can do that. If, as Biden said, Congress may have to likely tighten its belt under the Budget Reconciliation Act. But here, the subsidy recipient universe has been expanded from low-income households making up to 135% above the poverty line to 200% above the poverty line. This has been a very successful program. I know a number of INCOMPAS members have been leaders in this. So again, this will help the deployment, one program very synergistic with the other. Next slide, please. $2 billion are going to the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Fund. Now, this is on top of 980 million that NTIA is already looking to pass to the tribes, where applications were due about 6 weeks ago, September 1. So there are tribes in virtually every state. Many of these deployment funds will be between 1 to 50 million. The adoption and use programs, 50,000 to 2.5 million, includes the Hawaiian homelands, Alaska Native corporations, and the funds can be used for deployment, affordability, technically neutral for deployment. So let me just stop for a second, because many of you were recipients directly or indirectly under BTOP, which was $4 billion. So this $2 billion plus the 980 million NTIA is separately expending. That's three quarters of what the NTIA had to spend a decade ago. Just to look at the size of this, we have a number of clients who have done very well partnering with tribes to expand and increase broadband deployment. Next slide. This is a terribly important slide. Actually, congressional hearings on this, on telehealth, telemedicine, just yesterday afternoon. Bipartisan support, almost $2 billion for this program. This would be a RUS, Rural Utility Service program under agriculture. As you can see, though, 20% of the funds, or 400 million, are for deployment. The rest of the funds are to be spent, for audio, video, visual, interactive equipment, terminal equipment, hardware or inside wire, other services, which support the deployment. So, and I think these funds will actually be further increased under the Budget Reconciliation Act. The next slide, 1.5 billion. As you see, we're going down in size. Another NTIA program. These are the households with income no more than 150% above the poverty line. Again, focused on rural areas to support the adoption initiatives. So also, money that will be given to the states in block grants. The next slide, 1.25 billion. Yet again, another NTIA program, very similar to the state digital equity grants. Focused, much more on rural areas, low income areas. Again, technology neutral, but I think, in many instances, a implicit preference for fiber. Many of you would be interested in the next slide, the mid-mile broadband slide. As I mentioned, the first bucket, the 42.5 billion, is N-mile, last mile, but can also be N-mile / mid-mile. This bucket, this $1 billion bucket, is entirely for mid-mile. Again, the NTIA is administering it. The NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, 180 days after enactment. So I would say probably next late spring, awards within 270 days of the NOFO. Here, there is also a match by the subrecipient, but unlike the 25% match under the $42.5 billion budget, the match here for mid-mile facilities is a 33.0% match. Again, I think some or a significant part of that match can be done with either soft dollars or with in-kind contributions to the states or the localities. Also technology neutral, but probably a bias or leaning toward fiber, targeting unserved and underserved locations. But here, Congress made it very clear they don't want fiber bridges to nowhere. They want these mid-mile networks connected to end-mile providers, with a cohesive plan on providing broadband connectivity. So, separate NTIA program will run in parallel to the $42.5 billion program. Finally, 74 million, which in our discussions today seems like relative pocket change, is the ReConnect program to be administered by the USDA. This is entirely a rural area focus. What do I mean by that? Locations that don't have a town of 20,000 or locations that are not contiguous or adjacent to a city or town of 50,000. So frankly, I think it's more ex-urban / rural, but clearly not suburban, urban. And this is a USDA program, grants and loans. Starting to see USDA do more grants than they have historically. So that sums it up. I mean, again, an extraordinary program. You have the ability to go in there now and lobby your state. I think like most of our clients, the 80-20 rule applies. Probably 80% of your network are in 20% of the states you're in. And we're happy to answer any questions in terms of how to devise a successful lobbying scheme for the economic development agencies, for the broadband commissions, for the governor's offices, who are the recipients of these block grants, who in turn will be fairly quickly selecting the subrecipients to build out these broadband networks.